Today I have the honor of introducing a person who was a war veteran, Rhodes Scholar, White House Fellow, a Clinton Global Initiative Lead Fellow, a guy who threw up on me at our first play date in 3rd grade. Twice. I didn't forget.
You got a good memory, man.
I was also the best man at his wedding, and he'll be the best man at my upcoming wedding. Oh, thank you. I wasn't looking for that, but thanks. Please stand to greet my best friend, Wes Moore.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Everybody hear me okay? Thank you so much. First, I just want to, first I just would like to, thank both Justin and Mr. Brandon for not just the introduction before, just for your lifelong friendship. I mean, this has been my guy ever since we were 3rd grade. I mean, he was someone who you could always go to. You could always talk with, no matter, and someone who would never judge you, no matter what. And so I love Mr. Brandon, sorry. I love Mr. Brandon from the bottom of my heart, and I always will. And that's what my mother actually calls her good son. So, it's just a great guy. And also just thank you, EA, for this opportunity, for all the leadership and the teachers, and for the students, for just your time and attention, during this time, the opportunity to share with you some of these stories. And I think what's really what's been so much fun about this process, and what's been really amazing about this process, and I know Mr. Brandon can definitely verify, but what's been amazing about this journey that we've been on, that I've been on really for the past few months with this book, is that anyone who would have known me 15 years ago, the last thing they'd ever expected me to be doing is sitting there and talking about the successes of life. Because that was farthest from the trajectory that I was already on. When I was 3.5 years old, my father passed away when I was living down in Maryland, and he died unexpectedly. He actually was he was in radio and television, and he had finished his evening broadcast on television, and he came home and he was complaining about his throat. He's saying something's wrong with his throat, and that night, he tried to get some sleep, and he was having a lot of trouble sleeping. So the next morning when he woke up, my mother then took us to, he went to the hospital by himself. He went to the emergency room. My mother then took us to a family member so they could watch over us. And when she got to the hospital, she noticed that my father, that his head kept on flopping from side to side. And she asked the doctor what they thought was wrong, and they said, well, he probably didn't get a whole lot of, he told me he couldn't sleep last night because of his throat. He probably didn't get much sleep, so he's probably just very tired. And so basically they just then sent him home, and with the diagnosis to get some rest, and if it feels like it's continuing to get worse, then he should come back to the hospital. As later on we began to realize that the reason that his head kept on flopping from side to side was that my father was suffering from something called acute epiglottitis, which essentially is the swelling of the epiglottis, which all of us have an epiglottis every time we chew or we speak or we breathe. Air goes in your body and allows you to, allows that constant flow of air to happen. And his became so swollen that eventually it just sat on top of his windpipe. So essentially what happened was his body was suffocating itself. The reason that his head kept on flopping side to side was not necessarily because he was tired, but because he was losing air. And 5 hours after he was released from the hospital, I was sitting down at the kitchen table, and my mother and my sisters were inside the kitchen. And I heard my father start to come down the stairs. And I did what any 3.5-year-old would do when you hear your parent coming down the stairs. I immediately ran to the stairs so he could pick me up. And then I looked up, and then I saw him collapse down the stairs. And I remember just standing there and just staring, not sure what was going on. Then I heard a crash inside the kitchen. My mother then ran inside, saw her husband on the stairs. My older sister, who was 9 at the time, started calling 911. So there was nothing but chaos going on at that point all around me. And I remember just standing there and just staring. By the time that the first responders came quickly. By the time they came, they got his body onto the gurney, and they put him inside of the ambulance. And we found out later on that he had died on the way to the hospital. And so that transition, my mother was now instantaneously a widow with these 3 children, myself and my 2 sisters. And that transition became extremely difficult for her. And so one of the first things, so after being there for a few years and trying to do it all by herself, she eventually called her parents, my grandparents, who were living up in the Bronx, and said, I need some help. And they said what she'd hoped they would say, and they said, come on up. And so the whole family then moved up to the Bronx. And what was happening in the Bronx during that time was the Bronx was one of many cities around the country that was going through something that we all now know as really that birth of the crack epidemic that was taking place in so many cities around the country, where you were watching neighborhoods literally implode upon themselves because of small white rocks and the impacts that was having on families and on communities. And so I increasingly found myself becoming very lost and very confused. My mother then sent me across town to go to a school. That's where I first met Mr. Brandon. You know, Mr. Brandon, ironically, we connected for a whole lot of different reasons, but one of the main reasons was we were two of the only kids that actually had to go across town to go to this other school. And so that process was challenging because you found yourself now inside this school where you were becoming too rich for the kids in the neighborhood who didn't understand why you had to go all the way across town just to go to school, and too poor for the kids in school who didn't understand why you lived all the way in the Bronx. And so that type of confusion really manifested itself into a lot of anger and confusion. My grades started turning bad. I was involved in the juvenile justice system up in New York. I was on academic and disciplinary probation at school. And so then my mother decided that she was going to make a change. And she decided that the next step would be to send me off to a military school. Now, the military school, and I know all y'all from this area, the military school was in Wayne, Pennsylvania, a military school called Valley Forge, a place I knew nothing about. I didn't know Pennsylvania. I wanted nothing to do with Pennsylvania. And now here she was sending me off to this military school in the middle of Pennsylvania. And one thing I knew before I got sent to military school is I knew cities. I know big buildings, I know lights, I know sirens, I know noise. That's how I fell asleep at night. If things were too quiet, I couldn't even fall asleep because I was a little too nervous about why things were so quiet. And so now here I was getting sent off to this military school. And so for folks who know Wayne and know Valley Forge, it's a pretty woody area. In many ways, it almost seems like they just took the woods and just cut out this square in the middle of the woods and dropped the school right in the middle of it. So here it was in my first days of military school. And to say I hated it there, I think would almost be putting a pleasant spin on it. I mean, I hated this place when I first showed up. Those first days, that first morning, by the first time they woke us up to heavy metal music and threw me off on my bed and started yelling and screaming at me and started cursing at me and calling me things I'd never heard before, I was like, I'm through with this place. And literally, in the first 4 days, I had already run away 4 times from the school. Every time they turned their backs, I was like, scaling the walls, just trying to get out of that place. I mean, I just wanted to go home. And I wanted people to leave me alone. And every time they'd scream and they'd turn their back, they'd turn around and there was someone missing. And that someone was me. And so the first 4 days, I'd already run away those 4 times. And so then my squad leader, is this guy from Connecticut. He had like this sandy blonde hair. And so my roommate and I are sitting inside the room. Remember, I'm 12 years old at this point and hated every minute of it there. He comes into my room. My roommate, calls him to attention. We get to attention. And then he says to my roommate, get out. So my roommate dutifully scurries out of the room and leaves me alone. So the first thing I'm thinking is, whatever's about to go down, this is not good because he doesn't want witnesses. So I'm standing there at attention. My fists are clenched. I'm like, I don't know what's about to happen, but I'm ready. And then he tells me to sit down. So I grab my seat and I sit down. And I look at him. I say, what's about to happen now? He takes my roommate's seat and he sits down. And up until that point, every time I tried to run away from the school, I kept on trying to find the train station in Wayne. I don't know if y'all know the train station in Wayne, but that train station, I could then hop on the train station in Wayne. I could take that to 30th Street, right? Get on the train in 30th Street. I could take that to Penn Station. Right at Penn Station, I could hop on the 2 train. 2 train takes you right back to the Bronx. So I had the whole thing mapped out in my mind. I just need to get to this train station in Wayne. So he sits down and he's like, listen, Moore. My last name. He's like, listen, Moore. You know, you don't want to be here. And quite honestly, we don't want you here. So I've drawn you a map on how to get to this train station to avoid any more pathetic attempts of just running around trying to find where this train station is. So I'm looking at this map that he gives me, and I'm looking at him like he just handed me a piece of gold. I'm like, tears are welling up in my eyes. I'm like, y'all, I'll never forget you. You know, when you get out, let me know. We'll get together. Lunch on me. And he just looks back at me. He's just like, just get out of here. And so I had this whole great escape planned out. So later on that night, we had something called taps at 10 o'clock every night. Taps is basically lights out. And you know when they do that dun, 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 that sound. And so taps is at 10 o'clock at night. That wake-up call that I dreaded every single morning happened around 5:30. And so I'm like, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set my alarm for like 11:30 because everyone should be asleep by then, but then they'll still give me a nice little head start, so by the time they realize that I'm gone, I'll probably already at least be in Penn Station by then. So I set my alarm for 11:30. I put my alarm clock under my pillow. The alarm goes off at 11:30. Wakes me up. I quickly shut it off. I say peace to my roommate. See you on the other side. Grab my bag, and I have my little bag, like a little granola bar, and a flashlight and my map. So I was ready. I leave the gates, and I'm going through the woods, and I'm trying to follow this map to a T. And he had good directions. He was like, 20 paces straight, you're going to see a big tree, then you make a left. So I'm walking through the woods, and I'm like, yo, this is the woods. What do you mean a big tree? There's nothing but big trees around. But I follow his directions, and I go out my 20 paces, and I see a big tree, and I make a left, and then I go out, 15 paces, you'll see a big rock. I'm like walking past rocks all over me. And I see a big rock, and then I do whatever, and I'm following these directions. I'm following. And then out of nowhere, and then again, I'm from the city. And then now I'm in the middle of the woods. And I feel like with these directions, I just keep on going deeper and deeper and deeper into the woods. So my imagination is going crazy now. I'm starting hearing things that, I'm hearing like elephants and bears. And I literally just sit down and I start crying. Because there's nothing that I wanted to do more at that point than just to go home. There's nothing more that I wanted at that point than just for people to leave me alone and let me be. And so I sit down and I'm crying and I start hearing more leaves, and I thought it was just more elephants. And then I start hearing laughter. And it was my whole chain of command. They'd follow me out into the woods. The map was fake. The map took you to the middle of the woods. They just wanted to see how bad I wanted to go home. And that night they got their answer.